Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to be here with Carlos Gutierrez, who's visiting us from the US. He's currently the chair of Albright Stonebridge Group, and he was Secretary of Commerce from 2005 to 2009 under the George Bush administration. So thank you for coming, and thank you for finding the time to do this. Now, I have a very brief list of questions, but I wanted to ask you first of all about trade issues, given your experience in the field. What do you make in general of the assessment of the current U.S. administration about the validity and the efficacy of the trade arrangements that the U.S. is engaged in? So do you buy the concept that the U.S. has done poorly in trade and has been ripped off by some of its trading partners?
You can always improve trading relationships. There are always ways of perfecting trading relationships. But I don't think that the situation warrants the kind of trade war that we're in. It started with the assumption that trade deficits are bad,
right?
Which I personally don't agree with. It's like a financial statement, a P&L. The trade deficit is a line item. It's called net exports, and it's all part of the economy. Interesting that when the economy grows, the trade deficit grows. When it declines, as it did in 08, 09, the trade deficit declined. So I think it is a very bad proxy to gauge success or failure. And that's how it started. And that has evolved to technology. But no, I don't agree. I think we're doing more harm than good. And I think at the end, what we may end up with is an international system without any rules, without any guidelines. So no, I'm not a proponent of what's happening.
And on some of the revisions that we've seen, so the revision of NAFTA, do you think that this is one of the cases where slight improvements to the agreement were possible and were achieved, like the administration claims, or do you think that that's not the case? I mean, is the reviewed agreement
I think
better?
the word you use is slight. I think that's a good word. But it wasn't a revolutionary new agreement. Ironically, it was pretty much what TPP would have been. So we got out of TPP and we replicated TPP with Mexico. So it's a modernization. NAFTA was 25 years old, e-commerce wasn't around, and that needed to be done, but it wasn't a revolutionary new agreement that will create jobs in the U.S. At a record pace.
On the also on this, I mean, do you think the way the Trump administration is using trade to extract concessions on foreign policy and on other issues, I mean, are this new way of understanding trade and tariffs as part of the portfolio of tools that the administration has on a whole range of other issues, do you think that's effective and sustainable, or have you seen cases of success of this? It's definitely different from what past administrations have done.
You know, traditionally, in U.S. foreign policy, the concept of linkage has been avoided.
Right.
There was one case with the Soviet Union where we made a deal with wheat, but that was an exception. Today, everything is linked. You know, we've heard the president say that he would take away steel tariffs if he got a good deal on North Korea. He said that Huawei is dangerous, but we can include that as part of the negotiation. Even the extradition of the Huawei CFO. So everything is linked. And I think that is it's a big problem.
You mentioned Huawei, and I have to ask you about China and the trade war with China. What do you think are the drivers of this? And if you were to play this forward a couple of rounds, where do you see this headed?
Well, Huawei has a reputation in the U.S. which will be very difficult to put behind us. And I don't have the classified information as to why, but there are deep concerns about Huawei. I don't know if they are still valid, because I remember they were concerns 15 years ago. But Huawei is a force. It is one of the world's most sophisticated technology companies. And if we go after Huawei, they will go after somebody else. And if we start destroying companies, then we've taken this to a new level. So now we have a list of companies where US companies can't sell to, starting with Huawei. So that means that there are US companies that are giving up over $1 billion of sales because of this regulation. In return, China has developed a list of what they call the unreliables. So it's now coming down to what companies do we destroy? So these trade discussions are becoming destructive.
Right. But how worried are you about the underlying argument that, in fact, this is not so much about trade, but it's about the Chinese being able to occupy the technology frontier? They seem to be doing very well on both scales. Large tech companies, they're doing well in that scale. They're doing well in technological entrepreneurship. If you could see a map of the world of tech unicorns, it'll be fundamentally in China and the US. China has really caught up, and the Chinese Made in China 2025 strategy seems to point in that direction. Do you buy the argument that, in fact, what we're looking at is a much broader trend of just collision of these two countries, in part produced by the capacity of the Chinese to do very well in the technology and the economic space, and the worry that this creates in the US? I mean, is this part of a bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. The traditional policy towards China has been that the rise of China is a good thing. It's good for the world, it's good for the market, it increases consumption, it's good for everyone, until now. And now we have labeled China a strategic competitor. Competitor they have always been, and they always will be. But strategic suggests that they could be an existential issue. And I think that's taking it too far. I don't believe that China necessarily has to become an enemy. But this is, it almost seems as though it is intended to hold the rise of China.
Right.
They're becoming too big. They're becoming too successful. Well, that's a problem. But the way to solve that is, yes, we have to get the rules right, and we have to make sure that we're not cheating the system. But the way to beat China is through innovation, through competition. And I think we need to be asking ourselves, why is China ahead of us in 5G? 70% of the robotic activity is in Japan, China, and Korea. Why? So those are questions that I think we need to be asking ourselves. And the idea of having a foreign policy intended to stop China, I think is self-defeating. We're wasting time. We need a foreign policy that advances the interest of the U.S., not just that puts China down.
One final question on China, and then I'll ask you about Cuba. But on China, you know, there's this narrative about opening the WTO, opening our markets to Chinese firms, because that would produce political convergence, right? So economic convergence and the rise of a Chinese middle class would precipitate a political transition. But because we haven't seen that, on the contrary, under Xi, we seem to be seeing the opposite. Does that mean that now the policy is one of containment rather than opening? So when you were in the Commerce Department, was this narrative part of your strategic vision, that we would open to China and to so many other countries because through economic prosperity we would in fact see a democratization, and that is now gone? I mean, do you buy that narrative at all? And it's been out there.
I've never bought the idea that we can turn China into a Jeffersonian democracy. It's not their culture, it's not their history. If that's the objective, we're going to fail. China is China. They have their history, they have their values. They're very different to U.S. history and U.S. values. So I think the policy, the goal, the vision should be one of coexistence.
Okay.
And the interesting part will be is how do you make two systems coexist, two different systems coexist? Up until now, what we've been trying to do is to change their system so that it's like ours. I don't believe that will happen.
Mm. Okay, final question. You were born in Havana. What do you make of the turn in the U.S. policy towards Cuba? And again, if you were to play this forward a couple of terms, how do you see that evolving? Because under Obama, we saw a very rapid opening of relations, and now we seem to be going backwards. What do you make of this? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the U.S.-Cuba?
In the longer term, I'm optimistic. I wasn't a member of Obama's party. I didn't vote for President Obama, but I think one of the best things he did was opening up relations with Cuba. Ironically, Cuba is beginning to open a private sector, and about 25% of the workforce is now privately held. It's privately employed. And at that moment is when we're cutting back, we're pulling back. And the irony is that we're not helping the Cuban people, we're actually hurting the Cuban people. So when I hear US public servants say, the reason we have the embargo in place is to help Cuban people, I would just ask them to go to Cuba and stand in line with someone and say, hey, do you think the embargo is helping you? And I don't think the answer will be yes. The polls are overwhelming. 97% of people liked the Obama initiative.
Right, of U.S.
Yes.
In the U.S. Yeah. Carlos, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your stay. Thank you, everybody.